Greetings, everyone. Welcome to SafeDefend Live. I'm Dave Evans in the bunker in Oklahoma with Dr. Greg Vecchi. It's been a crazy night last night. A lot of stuff going on in the world last night. Not our concern. We're going to talk about crisis intervention today and how you can help your students and your family and friends avoid the unthinkable. Doc, it's great to see you.
Good to see you, Dave. Always a pleasure. So, I figured that, we always talk about, dealing with a person in crisis, and we haven't really talked much about kind of what does that mean and how does that play out. And I try to bring a kind of unique perspective in this. When I was in the FBI, I spent my whole career as a hostage crisis negotiator, right? And then I taught crisis intervention team members in police forces after I retired. Various departments throughout the U.S., specifically in Missouri, focusing there. And, because it's not what we think it is. And if we look at it from the standpoint of targeted violence, really, as we talked about a million times, right? These people that, especially kids, right, that end up being the shooters, right? And there's no doubt that they're commit criminal acts and they have to be held accountable and stuff like this. But the bottom line is, as we've talked about, it's someone that we're going to most likely know. It's going to be a current or former student at about the 91% probability chance, right? So you're dealing with kids who have no life experience. You're dealing with kids as an expression of frustration. Violence becomes the answer, right? And we talked about this a lot, see something, say something, do something, the concerning person's in crisis. We've talked a lot about that. But then once you've identified that, what does it really mean? What does it really mean to them when they're in crisis? You look at it from a standpoint of a methodology and tactics and things like this. And what I want to share today, and I'm going to kind of continue this on maybe in the next couple SafeDefend lives that we do, as far as kind of getting into some skills and how to make this really work. Because a lot of times it's not what we think. We're kind of everyone is trained when you're talking about negotiation and persuading people and helping people. We all seem to do it from that reasonable man or reasonable person standard, right? Is that what would a reasonable person do? And the law is based on that. And we can go into ad nauseum about what the reasonable person is. The thing is that these people are not reasonable. When violence becomes the answer, it's not reasonable, from the standpoint that we think it is. And when we step in and say, we don't know the kid, we have no relationship with the kid, we're not credible with the person, or we're ignoring their crisis, we're ignoring the emotions, and we're jumping right in to telling them, what to do to fix it, or to, some people will go extremes and say, you just have to kind of suck it up and go talk to the bully yourself and all this. So there's all the wrong things that aren't going to help the crisis, and therefore it's actually going to solidify the extent to which they want to use violence. And so I kind of want to touch on this because there's a lot of commonalities between if you have a police barricaded situation and the hostage negotiator shows up, right? So you have a guy who loses his job, and and then he goes home and his wife is cheated on him and left him. And things like this. He goes into crisis, right? And he grabs her, and now we have a barricaded situation. And we know that story, right? It happens all the time, domestic violence related stuff, things like this. Well, it's a very similar situation. It's just a little bit different, right? And so when we're talking about targeted violence, pop up that first slide if you would. We've talked about it in terms of the grievance, right? And and I'm not going to cover what we've talked about a million times before, but just as a reminder, everyone gets grieved, right? But not every grievance results in violence, right? And that's the thing, and that we have to learn to assess is really, when is a grievance bad enough that violence becomes the answer, that they're on this pathway that everybody talks about. And that's one of the hardest things to do in threat assessment, because a lot of people just can't figure out, well, okay, we all know it's a grievance, but how do you know when the grievance is bad enough? Well, we know that because it's not a normal grievance. Everybody gets grieved, everybody gets frustrated, and very few people turn to violence. They usually end up resolving the grievance, whether it's with their peers or their teachers or their coworkers or whatever, right? So we have to say, okay, so those small amount of grievances that actually become violent, what does that mean, right? And so it basically means that the person goes into crisis. Go ahead and flip up that next slide. And so, where are they on this pathway, right? And so if you look at this stage 1 through 4 is basically our opportunity to stop the violence. And the way we stop the violence is to intervene with someone who is in crisis and who is determined on their own, based on their own perception, that violence is the answer, right? And the closer that we intervene with the person in crisis, the stage 1, the better chance we have that we're going to be able to get them off this pathway, right? The stairway to death and destruction, right? And if you wait until it goes to violent ideation and then research and planning, the closer it gets to the attack, the less of a chance you're going to be successful in dealing with the crisis. So the idea is immediately when you notice something concerning, report it, don't judge it, and just make sure that the right people who know how to assess this get that information. It's up to them to make that judgment on whether or not this is bad enough or it warrants an intervention, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to do, and this is what's really hard to do. But let's say that someone, a child, let's say a student, gets in with a bully, and he becomes crisis actually on this pathway, right? So let's say that we've done a good job on that. Now we know he's in stage 1. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And really all this means, this crisis thing means, and this is coming basically hostage negotiator 101, okay? In a law enforcement setting, right? People see the hostage negotiators. They show up to a crisis. And let's say we had this guy who lost his job, and now he's losing his marriage, and now he can't cope with it, and he freaks out, and he grabs the wife, and he puts a gun to her head, and now they're barricaded. And from his perception right there, he's having a really bad day. It's very acute. It's a crisis, right? We all understand that. But if you break it down, here's all that's going on in the crisis. This is it. This is all you got to understand, is that from their perspective, they can't cope with the situation. And from their perspective, there's no one else in their life at that moment that can help them, right? And they may or may not have tried to get help, but regardless, their perception is no one's can help me. I can't deal with it. And now I've got to deal with the crisis. The crisis has to end. And so violence is the answer. Hence, now we have a barricade situation with a husband who may or may not have already committed violence, but now has his wife at gunpoint, right? So as the negotiator, right, I would step in, okay, not knowing this guy from a load of coal, right? I don't know anything about this guy. And I would just simply say, hi, I'm Greg with the FBI. Are you okay? And that's my initial entry, regardless if it was a child molester, terrorist, bank robber, it doesn't matter, right? That is because here's the focus of a negotiator. They go in to become that social support. And if you look at this, if you can help them cope or become their social support, either one or both, the crisis goes away, violence is averted and stopped because there's no motivation left. So we can't go in, and this is going to be for next week, I was talking about, we can't go in and just tell them what to do, right? We got to go in there and do it from the perspective that we're there to help them, and we're the only person in that moment who really cares and really wants to be that helper and that social support. Because if I can get across to that person, become credible and influence that person and say, hey, I really want to help you. Seems like you're getting really screwed over by that bully. It really seems unfair. I'm really sorry you're going through that. Let me see if I can help you. And you help that person with the bully to stop bullying, whatever the proper intervention is. Then now there's no reason to kill. The motivation is gone. Okay. So the differences or the similarities is that the targeted violence bully is really no different than the guy who lost his marriage and his job, right? The difference is that the barricaded guy is more acute. It happens very, very quick. It usually lasts 24, 48 hours. That's the things that happen that make the crisis. In targeted violence, it's more chronic. It takes a little bit longer. And so that's why we have time. It's actually in our favor. because in these situations, just by virtue of the dynamics and the characteristics of this type of violence, it's planned. It doesn't just happen, right? And so there's time and opportunity to step in and help that kid or help that employee or help whoever that concerning person is with their problem through crisis intervention, through being that social support, and actually breaking that the whole formula that means that they're in crisis, thereby stopping violence. And that is the basis, the theory, the basis, the practice, the best practice, empirical based stuff, years of research on this. This is why hostage negotiation works in the worst scenarios possible, because the law enforcement officer goes in because they're coming from a perspective of crisis intervention and social support with no judgment on the subject, on the guy they're talking to, and they come from a helping perspective as their support, and it's about 90 to 92% effective. And so if we can take what works for hostage negotiation, which is what I've done in my research, and apply it to targeted violence and active killers, active shooter situations, why not? Let's try to make this better and stop the violence.
Well, I think it's interesting. You said a term I like, and I think it's the one that needs to be carried from this conversation. It's a question: are you okay? And I think a lot of our teachers are trained that when a student becomes disruptive in class, you get them out of the class and send them to the office. It's the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Now the second step to that is I'm talking to my administrators and to my counselors is when that person walks in, instead of jumping their backside for being disruptive, maybe you just look at them first and go, "Is everything okay?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on? Let's talk about it. You're having an outburst for some reason. I don't know what's going on, but I get it. What's going on? How can I help you?" Right? I think too many times, and I'm guilty of this too, is when somebody screws up, I'm going to pin them to the floor and make them run 40 gassers or whatever, right? To correct the behavior. But sometimes the behavior is driven from some kind of grievance that's going on in their life that you have no idea about. Mm-hmm. Right. And especially if it's a student that's not normally disruptive.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And you got to do it from, it's all about their perception, not what you think. That's the other thing that's often done is you go in with some prescriptive idea what's going on, and you're going to say, look, you're getting upset for nothing. This is nothing in the scope of life. And here's what you need to do. And we're trying to help, right? And we try to lay out, what they need to do where they need, all the stuff as far as directing them and telling them what their situation is. And that's the worst thing you can do, because all that does is it creates more crisis, because you're not acknowledging their crisis and how they're feeling. And what I'm going to cover tomorrow or next week is the difference between being able to influence and persuade, right, and using dealing with something that no one wants to deal with, and that's emotions. We all want to problem solve, and you can't go into a situation from a rational, instrumental state of mind and talk to a student who's in crisis, who's expressive and emotional, and think that you can connect with them on that level. You got to let them express themselves, diffuse the emotions in the situation before you can even get permission from them to give any sort of direction or guidance.
Now, Doc, I didn't mean to chuckle, but I just realized this is applicable in other areas of your life, because my spouse has told me this many times. She goes, I don't want you to fix anything. I want you to listen. Just sit there and listen. Stop trying to solve the problem.
And she's right. She is right. I'm telling you, she's right. And if a hostage negotiator's got to learn that, everyone's got to learn that, right? Because if you don't do that, you're not going to get anywhere.
So not only are we helping with school safety, we're going to save your marriage. So tune in next week. We're going to talk about to our counselors, our teachers, on how to diffuse situations. But more importantly, as a husband, you need to pay attention to this stuff, because it's going to make a difference in your marriage. You may make it to your 30, 40 years of marriage.
That might be the great value. That might be the best value that we can provide on this channel.
Absolutely. Well, Doc, it was great seeing you again. Look forward to next week's discussion. Again, if you're married, you want to come in for marriage counseling and school safety next week. We look forward to seeing you. With that, this edition of Safe Defend Live, Dave and Doc, we are out of here.
Have a great weekend.